You meet someone new. The chemistry feels electric, almost magnetic. Within weeks, you're convinced this person is different from all the others. You open up, share your vulnerabilities, invest your emotional energy. Then, slowly, the familiar patterns emerge. The same betrayals, the same disappointments, the same wounds reopening in your chest. And you stand there bewildered, asking yourself, how did I end up here again? But what if the problem isn't the people you're attracting? What if, as Carl Jung discovered through decades of clinical observation, you're unconsciously selecting them? Jung realized that we don't just stumble into destructive relationships by accident. We're drawn to them with an eerie precision, guided by invisible psychological forces we refuse to acknowledge. He called this the compulsion to repeat, the mind's strange insistence on recreating the exact conditions that wounded us in the first place. Jung documented hundreds of cases where people broke this cycle completely. They stopped attracting emotional vampires, narcissists, and unavailable partners not by changing their dating profiles or learning manipulation tactics, but by confronting what Jung called their shadow, the rejected parts of themselves they were projecting onto others. The transformation wasn't just about better relationships. It was about becoming psychologically whole for the first time in their lives. In this video, you'll discover why you keep choosing the wrong people even when you consciously know better, the specific psychological mechanism Jung identified that makes trauma repetition feel like destiny, and the precise internal work required to break these patterns permanently. This isn't about positive thinking or boundary setting techniques. This is about fundamentally altering the unconscious blueprint that's been orchestrating your relational failures. If you're new to the channel and haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button and like this video to support our work. Thank you for your support. Now, let's explore why your unconscious mind might be sabotaging your relationships. Picture a moth circling a flame. It knows on some instinctual level that the heat will destroy it. Yet it circles closer, mesmerized, unable to resist. This is what Jung observed in his patients who repeatedly entered relationships that activated their deepest wounds. They weren't stupid or masochistic. They were responding to something far more primitive than conscious choice, a psychological magnetism operating below the threshold of awareness. Jung noticed a disturbing truth early in his clinical practice. People who had been abandoned in childhood didn't avoid abandoners. They sought them out with uncanny accuracy. Victims of emotional manipulation didn't learn to spot manipulators. They felt most alive around them. It was as if the psyche contained a homing device calibrated specifically to recreate past trauma. And the more his patients insisted they wanted something different, the more precisely they selected partners who would deliver the same pain. Consider the woman who grew up with an emotionally unavailable father. She swears she wants a present, emotionally generous partner, yet every man she dates mirrors that original absence. She meets someone warm and available, and within weeks, she's bored, feeling no chemistry. Then she meets someone distant and withholding, and suddenly she's electrified, convinced this is profound connection. Her conscious mind wants availability. Her unconscious mind recognizes unavailability as love, or the man raised by a critical, controlling mother. He claims he's looking for an equal partnership with mutual respect, but observe his actual choices. He's attracted to women who subtly demean him, who need fixing, who recreate that familiar dynamic of trying to earn approval that never quite comes. When he dates someone who treats him well, he feels uncomfortable, like something essential is missing. What's missing is the wound he's learned to call intimacy. Jung understood that this wasn't random. Human beings, he argued, are meaning-making creatures. Our psyches cannot tolerate randomness, especially when it comes to suffering. If we were traumatized as children, our minds create a narrative to explain why. And that narrative always involves something we believe we lacked, something deficient in ourselves. The wound becomes intertwined with our identity. We become convinced that love feels like this, like earning, like proving, like never being quite enough. In his work with patients across decades, Jung documented that people unconsciously seek to resolve their childhood wounds by recreating them with different actors. The fantasy is that this time, if we're good enough, patient enough, understanding enough, the unavailable person will finally choose us. The critical person will finally approve. The abandoner will finally stay. It's a psychological quest for redemption that can never succeed because we're trying to heal a childhood wound through adult relationships. The patients who actually transformed weren't the ones who simply learned better red flags or developed stricter boundaries. They were the ones who turned their attention inward and asked the devastating question, what part of me needs this dynamic to feel like love? They stopped viewing themselves as victims of circumstance and started examining their own complicity in the pattern. Not blame, but responsibility. Not shame, but recognition. Many people spend decades in therapy discussing their trauma, understanding its origins, feeling validated in their pain, yet nothing changes in their actual relationship choices. Jung called this conscious realization without unconscious transformation. They know why they have their patterns. They can articulate them brilliantly. But the unconscious blueprint remains untouched, still running the same program, still selecting the same partners, still recreating the same outcomes. Jung proposed something radical. The work isn't to find better people. The work is to stop needing the dynamic that trauma created. It's to withdraw the unconscious projections we cast onto others, the fantasy that someone external can complete us, redeem us, or heal the original wound. The moment we stop needing that, the magnetic pull toward traumatizing relationships dissolves. We become genuinely available for something different, not because we've learned techniques, but because we've fundamentally altered our internal relationship to love itself. If you've recognized yourself in this pattern of repeatedly attracting people who activate your trauma, click the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for your support. Let's now examine what Jung discovered about why this pattern is so difficult to break, even when we're fully aware of it. The real question isn't why do we attract the wrong people? The question is, what psychological function does attracting the wrong people serve? Because until we answer that question honestly, until we understand what we're unconsciously getting from these painful dynamics, no amount of self-help advice will create lasting change. We'll just keep finding new versions of the same person, convinced each time that we've finally met someone different, until we wake up 3 months or 3 years later, standing in the ruins of another relationship, asking ourselves how we didn't see it coming. Jung knew we did see it coming. We chose not to look. The solution Jung proposed wasn't what most people wanted to hear. It wasn't a list of qualities to look for in a partner. It wasn't a boundary-setting workshop. It was something far more demanding and far less comfortable. He called it shadow work, the practice of confronting and integrating the rejected, disowned parts of yourself that you've been unconsciously projecting onto others. And he was clear. This work is not optional if you want to stop repeating trauma in your relationships. Jung introduced the concept of the shadow to describe everything about ourselves we cannot accept and therefore repress into the unconscious. For someone who was taught that anger is unacceptable, anger becomes shadow. For someone who learned that neediness means weakness, vulnerability becomes shadow. For someone raised to believe that selfishness is evil, any form of self-prioritization becomes shadow. These rejected qualities don't disappear. They live in the unconscious, exerting enormous influence over our choices, particularly in relationships. When Jung began his own confrontation with the unconscious in 1913, he wasn't sitting in a comfortable therapy session talking about his feelings. He had resigned from his prestigious position, ended his professional partnership with Freud, and entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological crisis. For several years, he deliberately isolated himself, recorded his dreams and visions in what would become the Red Book, and faced aspects of his own psyche that terrified him. This wasn't romantic or mystical, though Jung's language sometimes makes it sound that way. It was brutal. He encountered rage he didn't know he possessed, resentments he had never acknowledged, aspects of himself that contradicted his carefully constructed identity as a rational, composed psychiatrist. He realized he had been living a partial life, performing a version of himself while vast territories of his actual psyche remained unexplored and unintegrated. Jung spent hours in active imagination, a practice he developed where he would dialogue with figures that emerged from his unconscious, sometimes nurturing, sometimes destructive, always revealing. He didn't dismiss these figures as mere fantasy. He treated them as real psychological entities with their own intelligence, their own messages, their own demands. And what they demanded consistently was recognition, acknowledgement, integration into his conscious life. The process was not linear. There were days he questioned his sanity, days he wondered if he would ever emerge from this internal labyrinth. But gradually, something shifted. The parts of himself he had rejected and projected onto others, his own capacity for cruelty, his own need for power, his own primitive drives, became less threatening as he acknowledged them. He realized that denying these aspects didn't make him more moral or civilized. It just made him unconscious, driven by forces he couldn't see and therefore couldn't integrate. Jung emerged from this period with a fundamental insight. You cannot have a healthy relationship with another person until you have an honest relationship with yourself. And an honest relationship with yourself requires confronting your shadow, the parts of you that are jealous, vindictive, selfish, wounded, needy, controlling. Not to indulge these parts, but to recognize them, understand them, and integrate them consciously so they stop running your life from the basement of your psyche. For Jung, shadow work was the foundation of individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated person rather than a collection of socially acceptable performances. He observed that people who hadn't done this work were constantly at the mercy of their projections. They would meet someone and immediately cast them in a role from their internal drama: the rescuer, the villain, the parent, the lost love. They weren't relating to an actual person. They were relating to their own shadow, projected outward. This is why people who haven't integrated their shadow keep attracting the same relationships. They're not actually attracted to the person. They're attracted to their projection. They meet someone emotionally unavailable and project onto them the fantasy that if they can just break through that unavailability, they'll finally be worthy of love. They meet someone critical and project onto them the parent whose approval they never received. The other person is almost irrelevant. They're just a screen for the internal movie that's been playing since childhood. The work, Jung insisted, is to withdraw these projections, to stop seeing others as the solution to your internal fragmentation, to recognize that the wound you're trying to heal in your relationships is a wound that can only be healed internally through the painful process of acknowledging and integrating what you spent your life rejecting about yourself. It's not that relationships don't matter. It's that you cannot build a genuine relationship on the foundation of unconscious projection and unintegrated shadow. Jung was explicit about what this requires: regular periods of solitude for self-examination, brutal honesty about your own motivations and patterns, willingness to acknowledge your own capacity for the very behaviors you condemn in others, and courage to sit with the discomfort of seeing yourself as you actually are, rather than as you imagine yourself to be. No therapist can do this work for you. No relationship can save you from it. It's the fundamental task of psychological maturity, and most people spend their entire lives avoiding it. This brings us to the practical question: if the problem is unconscious projection and unintegrated shadow, what does the actual work look like? What did Jung prescribe, not as theory but as practice, for breaking the compulsion to repeat trauma in relationships? Because understanding the concept intellectually is not the same as transforming the unconscious patterns that govern your choices. Let's be clear about what shadow work actually is. It's not journaling about your feelings. It's not affirmations or visualization or any of the comfortable practices that have been marketed under this term. Shadow work, as Jung practiced and prescribed it, is the systematic confrontation with the parts of yourself you've disowned, the qualities you judge in others with particular intensity because you cannot tolerate recognizing them in yourself. And it requires a structure, a framework, or it becomes just another form of self-absorption that changes nothing. Jung developed what he called active imagination as the primary method for encountering the shadow. This isn't passive daydreaming. It's a disciplined practice where you engage directly with the figures, impulses, and rejected aspects that emerge from your unconscious. And for the specific pattern of attracting trauma-activating relationships, there are 4 essential components that Jung would recognize as legitimate psychological work rather than therapeutic tourism. First, radical self-observation. For 30 days, you document every moment of attraction or repulsion you feel toward others. Not just romantic attraction, any strong pull or strong aversion. Write down the specific qualities that attract or repel you. Be concrete. Then ask the question Jung would ask: where in my rejected self does this quality live? If you're intensely attracted to confidence, what insecurity are you disowning? If you're repelled by neediness, what vulnerability are you refusing to acknowledge in yourself? The shadow always reveals itself through the intensity of your reactions to others. Second, the withdrawal of projection. Identify the 3 people in your life who trigger you most intensely, the ones you find yourself obsessing over, resenting, or fantasizing about rescuing. Jung would have you write their names and list the specific qualities they possess that evoke such strong reactions. Then, the difficult part, you must find those exact qualities in yourself. Not similar qualities, the exact ones. The narcissist you can't stop thinking about. Find your own narcissism. The unavailable person you're desperate to win over. Find your own emotional unavailability. Until you can locate these qualities in yourself, you're still projecting, still unconscious, still destined to repeat the pattern. Third, the practice of solitude. Jung insisted that individuation requires regular withdrawal from social performance into genuine aloneness. Not loneliness, not isolation, but deliberate solitude where you're not performing for anyone, not seeking validation or connection, just sitting with your actual self. 2 hours per week minimum, with no phone, no distractions, no escape routes. In this space, you practice what Jung called active imagination. You allow figures from your unconscious to emerge. You dialogue with them, you ask them what they want, what they're trying to tell you, why they keep pulling you toward the same destructive patterns. Fourth, the shadow journal. Every night, before sleep, you write one paragraph answering this question: what did I do today that contradicted my self-image? This is brutal because it forces you to acknowledge your own hypocrisy, your own capacity for the behaviors you judge in others. You said you value honesty but lied to avoid conflict. You claimed to be independent but manipulated someone for attention. You pride yourself on being compassionate but felt satisfaction at someone else's failure. Jung knew that the shadow grows stronger in denial and weaker in acknowledgement. The journal isn't about shame, it's about consciousness. These 4 practices form the core of what Jung would prescribe for someone trapped in the compulsion to repeat trauma through relationships. He practiced them himself, documented them extensively in his later writings, and observed that the patients who committed to this structure, genuinely committed, not just intellectually entertained it, experienced a transformation that went far beyond improved relationship choices. They became fundamentally different people, no longer driven by unconscious wounds masquerading as preferences. Jung was adamant that this work requires absolute honesty and zero self-deception. You cannot do shadow work while simultaneously maintaining your innocence, your victim identity, your conviction that you're the exception to these patterns. The moment you start making excuses, yes, but my situation is different, yes, but they really were that bad, yes, but I've already done so much work, you've left the territory of genuine transformation and returned to the comfortable land of self-justification. This is why most people never actually do shadow work. They read about it, talk about it, maybe even journal about it, but they never truly confront the devastating reality that they have been complicit in their own suffering. Not responsible for the original trauma, that's crucial to understand, but responsible for the compulsion to repeat it, for the unconscious selection of partners who activate it, for the projection of unintegrated shadow that makes genuine intimacy impossible. Jung observed that the patients who broke free from destructive relationship patterns all shared one quality. They stopped waiting for the right person to appear and started becoming the person who could no longer tolerate those dynamics. They didn't change their type. They changed their unconscious, they withdrew their projections, they integrated their shadow, and suddenly the people they used to find irresistibly attractive felt boring, predictable, transparent. The magnetic pull had dissolved because the internal wound-seeking external resolution had been addressed at its source. But here's what Jung rarely emphasized and what most people discover too late. This work will make you uncomfortable in ways you cannot anticipate. Because when you start withdrawing projections and integrating shadow, you're not just changing your relationship patterns, you're dismantling the entire psychological structure you've built your identity around. The victim narrative that's given you sympathy, the wound that's made you special, the dysfunction that's become familiar enough to feel like home. And that leads to a confrontation most people are not prepared for. There's a moment in every genuine psychological transformation that Jung called the dark night of the soul, though he stripped it of all religious romanticism. It's the moment when you've committed to the work, when you're doing the practices, when you're confronting your shadow and withdrawing your projections, and suddenly you feel worse. Not better, worse, more alone, more aware of your own complicity, more terrified of what it means to live without the familiar patterns that have structured your entire relational life. This is the true test of shadow work, not whether you can understand the concepts intellectually or talk eloquently about projection and trauma. The test is whether you can sit in the unbearable discomfort of recognizing that you have been choosing your suffering, that the people who wounded you were not random accidents but unconscious selections, that your wound has been your identity, and giving it up means not knowing who you are without it. In this silence, in this confrontation with your own patterns, a specific kind of psychological pain emerges. It's not the pain of trauma itself. You've felt that before. It's the pain of clarity, of seeing yourself with ruthless honesty, of recognizing how much time you've spent in relationships with people you didn't actually know because you were relating to projections, fantasies, unconscious scripts, of realizing that genuine intimacy would require showing up as your actual self rather than the performing self you've been presenting for decades. Your mind will offer escape routes. Suddenly, you'll meet someone new who seems different, who activates that familiar intensity, and every cell in your body will scream that this is the exception, this is finally the right person. You should abandon this uncomfortable internal work and pursue this connection. Or you'll convince yourself that the problem isn't your unconscious patterns, but your therapist's approach, this particular framework, the way shadow work is too negative or dwelling too much on the past. The mind is brilliant at finding reasons to abandon the work right before the breakthrough. But if you stay, if you resist these escape routes and continue sitting with the discomfort, something remarkable begins to emerge. You start noticing the actual mechanisms of your projection. You meet someone and feel that familiar magnetic pull, but now you can see it's not attraction to them as a person. It's attraction to the opportunity to replay your wound. You recognize the feeling of pursuing someone unavailable not as love, but as the psychological reenactment of trying to earn your parents' affection. The pattern becomes visible in real time, and visibility is the beginning of choice. Jung wrote in his late work, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is the transition point. The moment when what felt like destiny, I just always end up with the wrong people, reveals itself as unconscious repetition. What felt like chemistry reveals itself as familiarity. What felt like connection reveals itself as projection. And in that revelation, something loosens. The compulsion weakens. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, unmistakably. The discomfort serves a function. It's burning away the psychological infrastructure that's been keeping you trapped, the victim identity that protected you from responsibility, the wound that made you special, the fantasy that the right relationship would heal your childhood, the belief that you're deficient in some fundamental way that makes you unworthy of real love. All of this gets incinerated in the fire of genuine self-confrontation, and what remains is something raw, uncertain, but infinitely more real than what you've been living. This is where most therapeutic approaches stop. They help you understand your patterns, feel validated in your pain, develop coping strategies. But Jung went further. He insisted that understanding isn't transformation. Transformation requires that you metabolize the shadow, integrate what you've rejected, and emerge as a fundamentally different person. Not a healed version of who you were, a different person entirely, someone who no longer needs the wound to feel like themselves. You start to notice that relationships that once would have hooked you for months now reveal their dysfunction within days. The emotionally unavailable person still appears, but instead of feeling challenged to win them over, you feel a quiet boredom. The narcissist still tries to draw you in with intermittent reinforcement, but instead of getting tangled in their web, you see the mechanics clearly and walk away without drama or second guessing. The change isn't that you've developed better boundaries. The change is that you no longer need what these dynamics offer. Jung understood that true transformation doesn't feel triumphant, it feels like loss. You're losing the familiar patterns, losing the identity built around your wound, losing the fantasy that someone will finally see you and complete you. You're losing the right to blame others for your relationship failures. You're losing the comfortable story about yourself as someone who just has bad luck with people. And in that loss, in that disorienting space where you don't know who you are without your wound, the possibility of genuine selfhood emerges. The shadow work creates space for something Jung called psychological authenticity, the ability to show up in relationships as your actual self rather than a performance designed to earn love. But that authentic self can only emerge after you've confronted and integrated the parts of yourself you've been hiding, projecting, and denying. It's not a comfortable self. It's not always likable, but it's real, and relationships built on that foundation are categorically different from relationships built on mutual projection and unconscious wound matching. This confrontation doesn't end. That's the part Jung emphasized that people hate to hear. The shadow isn't a problem you solve once and move on from. It's a dimension of the psyche that requires ongoing attention, ongoing integration, ongoing honesty. The moment you think you've transcended it, you've just stopped looking. The moment you decide you're enlightened or healed or beyond these patterns, you've recreated the split between who you think you are and who you actually are. The work is lifelong, not because you're broken, but because consciousness is an achievement that must be maintained or it collapses back into unconsciousness. But here's what happens on the other side of this confrontation. You become someone fundamentally different in relationships, not because you've learned techniques or boundaries or communication skills, because you're no longer unconsciously seeking someone to complete you, heal you, or validate your worth. And that changes everything about who you attract, who you're attracted to, and what becomes possible in intimacy. The transformation happens slowly, almost imperceptibly. One day you realize you haven't thought about your ex in weeks. Another day you notice you're not scanning every room for potential romantic connection. You stop checking your phone compulsively. You stop analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings. It's not that you've become indifferent to relationships. It's that the desperate, wound-driven hunger has dissolved. You're no longer looking for someone to save you because you've stopped needing to be saved. Then you reappear in the world. This is Jung's language, reappearance. After the descent into shadow work, after the confrontation with your unconscious patterns, you emerge into social life as a different person. And here's the irony. Most people don't recognize the difference. Your old friends still see you through the lens of who you were. Your family still expects you to play your assigned role. The people who knew you as wounded, as struggling, as the one with relationship problems, they often resist this new version of you because it disrupts their understanding of themselves in relation to you. You're calmer now, but people interpret it as distant. You're less reactive, but people say you've become cold. You're no longer available for the familiar dynamics, the drama, the crisis, the endless processing of relationship problems, and people who bonded with you through those dynamics feel rejected. They ask what's wrong. They tell you you've changed. They're right, you have changed. But they cannot see that the change is toward integration, toward wholeness, toward a more authentic way of being, because that's invisible to people still operating from their own wounds. What disturbs people most is your new relationship to suffering. You're no longer performing your pain. You're no longer seeking sympathy or validation for what you've been through. You've processed it, integrated it, and moved on. This makes people uncomfortable because your wound was serving a social function. It made you relatable, sympathetic, safe. Your healing threatens that. It reminds them of their own unintegrated pain, their own avoidance of shadow work, their own attachment to victim narratives. The people who stay in your life through this transformation are rare. They're the ones who were never bonded to you through dysfunction. They're the ones who can recognize and celebrate your growth even when it means the relationship has to evolve into something new. But most people will fall away. Not through conflict or drama, through a quiet mutual recognition that you're no longer playing the game you used to play together, and that's okay. Jung called this the natural consequence of individuation. What emerges in your relational life is both anticlimactic and profound. You stop having those intense magnetic attractions that used to feel like destiny. When you meet someone new, you're curious about who they actually are, rather than immediately projecting your unmet needs onto them. You notice red flags not as things to fix or save, but as information that helps you make clear decisions. You're able to feel attracted to someone and simultaneously recognize they're not right for you, and walk away without drama or second guessing. This is the antithesis of what popular culture tells you love should feel like. There's no overwhelming passion, no sense of finally being complete, no dramatic chemistry that takes your breath away. Instead, there's clarity, ease, the ability to see someone clearly rather than through the distorting lens of your wound. And if you find someone who's done their own shadow work, who shows up with similar clarity and integration, the relationship that emerges is fundamentally different from anything you've experienced before. Jung described this as moving from projection-based relating to person-based relating. You're no longer in relationship with your fantasy of who the other person could be or should be. You're in relationship with who they actually are. They're not there to heal your childhood wound, prove your worth, or complete your identity. They're a separate, whole person with their own psychological reality, and you're capable of recognizing and honoring that because you've done the work of becoming whole yourself. The relationship doesn't feel like fireworks or destiny or coming home. It feels like two differentiated people choosing to share parts of their lives while maintaining their individual wholeness. There's conflict, but it doesn't activate old wounds because you've integrated those wounds. There's distance and closeness, but it doesn't trigger abandonment panic because you've developed internal security. There's difference and disagreement, but it doesn't threaten your sense of self because your sense of self is no longer dependent on the other person's approval or presence. This is what Jung meant by individuation in relationship. You become capable of intimacy precisely because you no longer need the other person to complete you. The paradox is that you can only truly give yourself to another person when you're not looking to them to give yourself back to you. You can only experience real connection when you're not trying to use connection to escape from yourself. You can only love freely when you're no longer trying to earn love to prove your worth. The transformation also affects how you move through the world. You're no longer broadcasting the unconscious signals that used to attract people who matched your wound. The anxious energy, the low-grade desperation, the subtle message that you needed saving, all of that has dissolved. And in its place is a quality Jung called groundedness, a sense of being rooted in yourself rather than constantly seeking external validation or completion. People who are attracted to chaos, drama, or dysfunction are no longer drawn to you because you're no longer offering those dynamics. What you start attracting instead, if you attract anyone at all during this period, which isn't guaranteed, are people who are also doing their work. People who take responsibility for their patterns. People who can see you clearly because they're not projecting their unintegrated material onto you. These connections feel different from the beginning. Slower, more conscious, less driven by unconscious compulsion, and more by genuine curiosity and compatibility. But Jung warned about something crucial here. The goal isn't to find the perfect relationship. The goal is to become a person capable of genuine relationship. And that capability emerges from shadow work, from integration, from the willingness to confront and metabolize your unconscious patterns rather than acting them out in your relational life. The relationship, if it comes, is a byproduct of that work. Not the goal, not the reward. Just a natural consequence of becoming psychologically whole. Jung would tell you that what you're really asking when you ask, how do I stop attracting the wrong people, is something deeper. How do I stop using relationships to avoid myself? Because that's what trauma repetition in relationships actually is. It's a sophisticated avoidance mechanism. You focus on the other person's unavailability so you don't have to face your own. You obsess over why they won't commit so you don't have to ask why you're attracted to people who won't commit. You blame them for activating your trauma so you don't have to take responsibility for choosing them despite or because of their capacity to activate your trauma. Shadow work is the practice of withdrawing attention from the external drama and turning it inward toward the psychological patterns generating that drama. It's alchemical work. Jung used that language deliberately. You're taking the base material of your unconscious compulsions and, through sustained attention and integration, transforming them into consciousness. This process is uncomfortable, slow, and offers no shortcuts. But it's the only process Jung found that actually worked. In his later writings, Jung was explicit about what this means for relationships. Most people never experience real intimacy because they never become real themselves. They remain collections of social performances, unintegrated shadow, and unconscious projections. They connect through these surfaces, mistake intensity for depth, confuse familiarity with love. And they spend their lives repeating the same relationship patterns while convincing themselves that each time is different because the other person's face is new. The work Jung proposes asks you to become real first, to integrate your shadow so you stop projecting it, to confront your wounds so you stop using relationships to reenact them, to develop internal wholeness so you stop seeking completion through others. This doesn't guarantee you'll find a relationship. It doesn't even guarantee you'll want one. What it guarantees is that if you do enter a relationship, you'll be bringing your actual self rather than your performing self, your consciousness rather than your unconscious patterns, your choice rather than your compulsion. Freedom for Jung meant freedom from unconscious repetition. It meant the ability to recognize your patterns, understand their origins, and make different choices. Not because you've overcome your past. You don't overcome your past, you integrate it, but because you've brought so much consciousness to your patterns that they no longer run automatically. You see the moment of choice. You feel the familiar pull toward the unavailable person and recognize it not as attraction, but as your wound seeking reinforcement. And in that recognition, you have the freedom to choose differently. This is the version of yourself Jung's work makes possible. Someone who's done the internal work to integrate their shadow, someone who's confronted their own capacity for the behaviors they judge in others, someone who's withdrawn their projections and taken responsibility for their relational patterns. This person doesn't blame others for their suffering, doesn't wait for the right person to appear, doesn't use relationships as a theater for unconscious dramas. They show up as themselves, integrated, conscious, grounded, and they're capable of genuine intimacy precisely because they're no longer desperate for it. The alternative is continuing the pattern, continuing to attract people who activate your trauma while convincing yourself each time that you couldn't have known, that they seem different, that you were unlucky again, continuing to focus on their behavior rather than your selection of them. Continuing to seek external solutions to internal problems, continuing to repeat the compulsion until you're too exhausted to care anymore, which is not the same as transformation. It's just resignation disguised as wisdom. Jung offers a different path, harder, longer, more uncomfortable, but real. The path of confronting your shadow, integrating your projections, and becoming psychologically whole not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. And what you discover on that path is that the question, how do I stop attracting the wrong people, dissolves. Not because you've found the right people, but because you've become a person for whom the distinction between right and wrong people is clear, immediate, and unambiguous. You simply know. And you act on that knowing without drama, without second guessing, without needing to process or analyze or hope things will be different. This is psychological maturity. This is what Jung's work makes possible. This is what's on the other side of genuine shadow work. Have you been repeating the same relationship patterns, attracting people who activate your deepest wounds, while telling yourself each time will be different? What parts of yourself have you disowned and projected onto others, mistaking that projection for love, chemistry, or destiny? Jung believed that the compulsion to repeat trauma in relationships is not fate, but unconscious programming, a psychological script written in childhood and reenacted endlessly until you bring consciousness to the pattern. He would say that freedom comes not from finding better people, but from integrating the shadow material that makes you unconsciously select people who will harm you. The work is internal, uncomfortable, and lifelong. But it's the only work that actually transforms the pattern at its source. If this video challenged how you think about attraction and trauma, or made you question the unconscious patterns driving your relational choices, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the human psyche through Carl Jung. Until the next video,